If you tried to explain this week's weather to someone using a single national forecast, you'd fail immediately because there isn't one. Houston is sweating through heat indices past 105 degrees for days in a row. Parts of the Midwest just got their first genuinely comfortable morning in weeks, only to watch storm chances build right back in. Behind it, Florida and Wisconsin both got hit with severe thunderstorm warnings within the same hour yesterday, 1,000 miles apart, for two completely unrelated storms. That's not four separate weather stories happening to overlap by coincidence. That's what one single, rapidly strengthening climate signal looks like when it reaches out and grabs an entire continent at once, and understanding that signal tells you something considerably bigger than just this week's forecast. It tells you what the rest of this year, and quite possibly next winter, is actually shaping up to look like. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this one, because I track exactly this kind of large-scale climate driver. The kind that explains not just what's happening this week, but why it's happening at all, and what it sets up for months down the road. Let's start with the single biggest factor behind everything we're currently watching unfold across North America, because without understanding this piece, the rest of the picture doesn't fully make sense. A super El Nino is actively strengthening in the tropical Pacific Ocean right now, and it has become the dominant atmospheric driver shaping weather across the United States and Canada as we move from late summer into fall, with forecasters expecting its influence to keep amplifying further into winter. This isn't a modest garden variety El Nino event. Current analysis of the benchmark Nino 3.4 region, the patch of tropical Pacific Ocean scientists watch most closely to measure this cycle's strength, shows sea surface temperature anomalies already exceeding the super El Nino threshold of 2 degrees above normal, with forecast models from the CFSV2 system projecting this event could push beyond a 3-degree anomaly at its peak. That trajectory puts this year's event on an even stronger developing path than the last major super El Nino back in 2015 and 2016. And if it verifies at the intensity current models are showing, it would rank among the strongest El Nino events ever recorded. Here's why that matters so directly for the wildly contrasting weather you're watching play out across the country this week. El Nino works by fundamentally reorganizing the Walker cell, the pattern of rising and sinking air that normally circulates across the tropical Pacific in a fairly predictable seasonal rhythm. Under normal conditions, that circulation follows a consistent pattern, but when a warm pool of water in the tropical Pacific becomes unusually large and persistent, as it clearly has this year, it reshapes the entire structure of rising and sinking air across the ocean basin, and that reshaping doesn't stay contained to the tropics. It ripples outward through the jet stream and into the broader atmospheric circulation across all of North America. And the strength of that ripple effect scales directly with how strong the underlying El Nino event actually is. A moderate El Nino nudges the pattern. A genuine super El Nino, the kind currently developing in the Pacific, right now doesn't nudge anything. It locks large sections of the jet stream into an amplified, exaggerated wave pattern. Exactly the kind of configuration responsible for producing simultaneous heat in one region, storms in another, and brief, temporary relief squeezed in between, all within the same national forecast. NOAA's own Climate Prediction Center has already built this influence directly into its official monthly outlook. The current forecast, issued for August, and reflecting exactly the kind of pattern we're watching unfold this week, highlights a broad area of increased odds for above-average temperatures stretching from the southeast through the mid-Atlantic and into parts of the northeast, with the single strongest signal for above-normal heat centered specifically across the southeast. That lines up precisely with what Houston has been experiencing this week, sustained triple-digit heat indices with no meaningful relief in the immediate forecast. At the same time, that same outlook favors cooler than average conditions across much of the northern Rockies and portions of the 8 northern plains, a genuinely different weather story playing out simultaneously in a completely different part of the country. Layer in the precipitation side of that same outlook, and the contrast sharpens even further. An enhanced monsoon signal is currently favored across the southwest and Rockies, driven by El Nino's well-documented tendency to strengthen moisture transport into that specific region during summer. And forecasters have specifically flagged this as good news for wildfire risk and water supply heading into late summer across an area that's badly needed the relief. Meanwhile, the southeast carries a distinctly dry lean in that same forecast, adding to concerns about drought expanding across a region already dealing with dry soil conditions feeding directly into its persistent heat. The southern plains, interestingly, don't carry a clear signal at all in the most recent outlook, specifically because typical El Nino patterns would normally point toward wetter conditions there, but recent trends and some model guidance are actually arguing for drier weather instead, landing that specific region on equal chances rather than a confident lean in either direction, a genuinely honest Acknowledgement from forecasters that even a strong, well-understood climate driver like this doesn't produce a perfectly clean, textbook outcome in every single region, every single time. There's also a distinctly regional storminess signal tied into this same broader pattern that helps explain exactly what's been happening across the Midwest and Ohio Valley this week. Separate long-range forecasting analysis has specifically flagged one of the most active weather patterns the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast have seen in some time this month, with frequent cold fronts and passing storm systems expected to bring above-average rainfall throughout the period. That active storm track has already been established over recent weeks according to this analysis, and it's expected to continue, making the Northeast one of the wettest regions in the country for the month, even as much of the central United States contends with persistent heat and dryness running in the opposite direction. That's exactly the mechanism behind the pattern we walked through with this week's brief Midwest relief sandwiched between two rounds of storms, an active, frequently passing storm track riding along the northern edge of the broader amplified wave, delivering repeated rounds of frontal passages rather than one single clean weather event. I want to spend a moment on the wildfire dimension of all this, because it's a genuinely important practical consequence of exactly the regional divergence we've been walking through, and it doesn't get nearly enough attention compared to the more headline-grabbing heat and storm stories. The National Interagency Fire Center's most recent outlook places above normal significant fire potential across most of the northwestern United States, stretching from central Utah, northwest Colorado, western Wyoming, and northwest Montana westward to the Pacific Northwest coast and northeast California. That same elevated risk extends across much of the northern plains, northern Minnesota, the southern plains, the lower Mississippi Valley, South Florida, and even Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Heading into September, that outlook shows potential returning to normal across much of the southern area, western Colorado, and southwest Wyoming, but persisting across northern Utah, northern Nevada, northeast California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, northern Montana, western North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and again, Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. That's a genuinely wide, geographically scattered fire risk picture, and it traces directly back to the same underlying divergence driving this week's temperature and storm contrasts. Drier conditions building in some regions, even as others catch genuine relief from an enhanced monsoon or an active northern storm track. Now, here's where I think this story becomes genuinely more significant than just explaining one unusual week of weather. This Super El Nino isn't a standalone summer event that's going to fade quietly once August ends. Forecasters are explicit that its influence is projected to trigger an amplified split flow pattern moving from late summer into fall and especially into winter, meaning the exact kind of divergent, amplified jet stream behavior we're watching play out across the country right now isn't a temporary quirk. It's the early, on-the-ground signature of a much longer seasonal transition that's expected to keep strengthening rather than settling down. The official NOAA Climate Prediction Center strength probability data shows a high likelihood for a very strong El Nino event, with the peak expected to arrive in late fall and early winter, meaning the atmospheric configuration currently producing this week's contrast between Texas heat, Midwest storms, and brief pockets of relief is genuinely still in its early stages relative to how strong this event's influence is projected to eventually become. That has real, meaningful implications, reaching well beyond just the rest of this summer. Early long-range outlooks for the coming winter are already pointing toward a specific, recognizable pattern directly tied to the same strengthening El Nino, a warm west, an active south, and increased snow risk for the eastern United States. That's worth sitting with, because it means the divergent, regionally split weather pattern currently producing wildly different conditions across the country this week isn't an isolated summer anomaly. You should expect to simply resolve back into something more uniform once fall arrives. It's the leading edge of a genuinely significant seasonal climate driver that meteorologists expect to keep reshaping conditions across North America for months to come, strengthening rather than fading as we move deeper into the back half of the year. I also want to address something genuinely important about how confidently forecasters can actually speak about an event like this, because I think it's easy to hear Super El Nino and assume the entire coming season is now locked in with total certainty. It isn't, and forecasters are honest about that uncertainty even while expressing high confidence in the broad strokes. August specifically remains one of the most difficult months of the year to forecast with real precision, because tropical systems can rapidly reshape rainfall patterns, especially along the Gulf Coast and southeast, in ways that even a strong, well-understood El Nino signal can't fully anticipate weeks in advance. A tropical system spinning up in the Gulf, even a relatively modest one, could meaningfully disrupt the dry, hot pattern currently dominating Texas and the broader southeast. just as it could reinforce or complicate the active storm track further north depending on exactly where it tracks and how it interacts with the broader amplified jet stream pattern already in place. That's a genuinely important caveat, not because it undermines the broader El Nino story, but because it's an honest acknowledgement that even the most significant seasonal climate driver still has to operate alongside shorter-term, less predictable weather features that can meaningfully reshape any single week's outcome. So what does all of this actually mean for how you should think about your own weather over the coming weeks and months, regardless of exactly which piece of this divergent national pattern you're currently living through? If you're in the southeast or along the Gulf Coast, treat this as a season, not a week, meaning the underlying heat and dry signal driving your current conditions is backed by a strengthening seasonal climate driver rather than a temporary ridge that's likely to break down on its own anytime soon. If you're in the Southwest or Rockies, the enhanced monsoon genuinely represents good news for drought and fire risk, but understand that it's arriving as intense, sometimes dangerous bursts of rain on already dry desert terrain, exactly the setup that produces serious flash flood risk even while genuinely helping the region's longer-term water supply picture. If you're anywhere across the Great Lakes, Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, or Northeast, expect this active, frequently stormy pattern to continue rather than ease, since it's directly tied to the same strengthening El Nino signal rather than a short-term fluke. And if you're anywhere across the broad swath of the country currently carrying elevated wildfire risk, particularly the interior Northwest, take that risk seriously, even if your personal weather has felt relatively ordinary, since the geography of this year's fire danger is shaped by exactly the same divergent pattern producing everything else we've walked through today. I'll be tracking how this Super El Nino continues strengthening through the rest of the year, particularly watching whether it verifies at the record challenging intensity current models are projecting, and how directly that strengthening translates into the winter outlook's early signals for a warm west, an active south, and increased eastern snow risk. This is exactly the kind of story that deserves ongoing coverage rather than a single explainer and moving on, because the pattern currently producing this week's wild regional contrasts is, by every indication forecasters currently have, still in its early stages rather than its peak. Subscribe so you don't miss that ongoing coverage, and drop a comment below letting me know which piece of this divergent national pattern you're personally living through right now, and whether it matches what this Super El Nino analysis would actually predict for your specific region. I read every one of these, and a story this geographically scattered genuinely benefits from hearing how it's landing in as many different places as possible. Stay weather aware, and stay aware of the bigger climate, signal driving it, because understanding where this pattern is actually headed is what turns this week's confusing, contradictory forecast into something that actually makes sense. I will see you in the next one.